Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the what if. Naruto woke up pissed, which is unusual. Emotions high and exhausted from both his work and the taxing conversations the day before he slept in his workshop, which is not unusual. The shop itself is actually a bit more like a small brick warehouse, for a lack of a better term, with a few rooms. The largest of which was obviously the shop itself. He had another room for storage and other things. And a third room that he had really just built into the first bigger room. This room contained the essentials. Which was really just a cot, a sink and a toilet. He had once debated on getting a mirror for the sink, but he eventually decided that was fancier than he cared to be. But after his very fitful night's rest he was no better off than he had been when he went to sleep, more or less after his argument with the toad jackass, leaving only a clone or two to take care of his project from the night before, so as to not ruin it. If anything, he was worse for the wear, his anger and regret from the day before causing him stress, not to mention the reopening of some very old and very deep wounds. It was safe to say he did not enjoy his sleep. But he did wake up with one thing, an idea, and a hell of a lot of drive. He got to work right away. As this would be the most difficult smithing undertaking he had done so far, it would require a lot of energy and concentration. But he believed he had a solution to the problem that Orochimaru had highlighted for him in the Forest of Death. To start off, after waking he dispelled his clones from the night before and gained their memories. Good, the annealing process from the previous day had gone well. At least 1 for 4 isn't great, but he would take it. Additionally, another clone had taken it upon himself to work on some Fuinjutsu script ideas for the new blade. Which is something he had resigned himself to require for basically all of his works going forward. Nothing insanely impressive, some scripts that allowed for further hardening, which he already put on anything of worth he crafted. And a secondary seal overlaid within the hardening one, which helped to keep the blade sharp, which is impressive but not amazing. It was something he had already been toying with already, but just never put in the time to finish the intricacies of it. In normal reality, you don't necessarily want a blade to be perfectly hard. They naturally needed some bend. But in the ninja world they had completely changed the game when it came to weapons. Moving at such intense speeds and swinging with as much force as a typical Junin can, would shatter most regular weapons with just one swing. So naturally weapons evolved, as they tend to do when you have a society built around the military. And weapons were being forged out of materials most civilian metallurgists would doubt the very existence of, and when you bring chakra into the forging process, it makes something that can hold up under pressures your average non-enhanced samurai would balk at. Apparently, his clone also spent some time going over some interesting theory ideas about interweaving Fuinjutsu seals within the material of the weapons as well. Which would require him to etch them into the billet before folding it over itself, and would also require him to keep it powered with enough chakra that the seal wouldn't just disappear into the metal, becoming inert. But he could deal with those interesting ideas later. Today he was going to finish his prototype. After sorting through these memories, Naruto went about the process of gathering his materials. First, the ingots he had his second clone make out of the sword Orochimaru broke. This would allow him to properly reuse the high-quality chakra-treated carbon steel alloy Masa Gigi had previously given him. Second was to study his previous plans for the weapon. A wakizashi 36 cm in length, with a standard handle and guard. After this he spent some time meditating, not only on the blade itself, the heft, length, how it felt in his hands, how it moved through the air when he used it to cut, even the feeling of it tied to his waist by a traditional rope. But also on his emotions, his intense anger, and the anguish he felt on that mission to Wave, losing his first family, his desperation. And then he began, first, by holding the materials in his hands, imagining the process of forging the blade, heating it up, shaping it until it was a perfect extension of himself, physically and spiritually. Using his chakra in a way that he has been practicing intensely for years. It was a little like fire chakra. Although Naruto guessed it felt that way because that was really the only thing remotely close to it. But really he worked it by, for a lack of a better term, forcing his chakra into the material, even becoming the material. Making him a part of the material and heating his chakra up to what he knew, from his years of training and experience, was the perfect temperature. He could almost literally see the steel heating up in his hand, stretching to take the shape in his mind, folding to what he knew would be the perfect density, something that a normal smith would be unable to achieve by hand. His concentration was so intense that he could hear the hammer in his mind. Extruding, shaping, folding. Again and again and again. While doing this he poured not only his intense chakra, but the intensity of his emotions, and he let it all go. Pouring it into the material, his mind almost became a sieve, letting his emotions and intentions for the blade pour out through its holes. This isn't the first time that he had done this, but it is only the second time he's gotten this far, and the first time it felt like this. True, this is technically still just the first 2 steps in chakra forging, but it has never felt this good, never been this right. Forging, extruding, those were the only 2 things left on Naruto's mind after he emptied it of his strong emotions from the night previously and his intense passion for this blade, the continuation of the blade that saved his life, of the blade that failed to save Ichiro and Yui, and how he could never let that happen again. He just let it all go. After what felt like hours or days he relaxed, not even noticing how tense he had become. He was so focused on this process. Opening his eyes expecting to see a piece of red-hot steel, he only saw the wakizashi, his wakizashi that he lost in Wave Country, and he almost felt a small part of himself return. Something he hadn't even realized was gone. But he knew he wasn't done yet, because he could still feel the intense heat left in the material of the weapon. The shank, where he would eventually place a grip, was in his hand and the blade extended out of it left horizontally, but the heat emanating from it didn't harm his bare hand. It was his heat, but he needed to cool it. And unlike many of his traditional weapons, this is the most difficult step, quenching. The thoughts racing through Naruto's head were intense, yet abnormally calm, almost as if he was at peace. If done wrong, too soon, or the weapon is wrong, it won't harden, but in chakra forging one could lose everything they worked hard for. Not only does it involve removing their heat, their chakra, from the weapon, they need to recirculate their chakra through the weapon and vent it out to cool the weapon. The process must be done at intense speeds. Pull the heat from the blade into your own body and then vent it out, only to push your chakra through it and repeat, again, and again, and again. At an intense rate of speed. In the past, Naruto has burnt out entire tenketsu in his hands practicing chakra quenching for hours and hours on end. It took him years to even figure this process out. Previously he had tried using wind chakra similarly to near fatal results. Stress turns into cracks, cracks turn into splinters, splinters shatter, and shattered heated steel is not something you want hitting you. That was before he eventually came to the realization that he could circulate and expel his chakra, a little bit thanks to the Hyuga. Seeing one of them expel chakra from their bodies when performing that spinning technique of theirs gave him an idea. This process, unlike the previous 2, was not one that made him feel better in the traditional sense. It didn't clear his mind, it didn't calm him down, and it certainly didn't make him feel well rested. But it did make him feel an immense sense of accomplishment upon feeling the blade successfully cool down. It took less than a minute, yet it used more than twice the amount of chakra as the previous 2 steps combined. Now comes the most vital step, tempering it with chakra. Now the blade did already hold his chakra, it was literally brimming with it, almost vibrating in his hand. He could feel the power thrum throughout his creation. But he knew if it was left like this for long the chakra inside of it would become inert. Inert chakra is a little bit like lightning, in that it wants to ground itself. Or in the chakra's case, rejoin the natural cycle of circulation. What many don't know is that chakra, when expended in a technique of any kind, doesn't just up and vanish. Energy can't be created or destroyed, only change forms. Chakra is everywhere, in the air, the rocks, water, trees, etc., and once expelled from a body it goes back into nature. But inert chakra, or chakra that has been expended and therefore wants to change forms, once trapped, needs to return to the cycle. And becomes intensely powerful and volatile in order to do this. But if one is able to settle inert chakra, then you not only have chakra imbued in the weapon making it exponentially stronger and more dangerous, you have inert chakra imbued in your weapon. Which is chakra on the level of natural energy, possibly more so. Naruto hasn't been able to directly compare the 2, he only learned of the existence and strength of natural chakra from significant and expensive amounts of research into the subject. Naruto has spent a small fortune, everything he could scrounge and save, to pay merchants to find or bring certain texts to him, and even then he would often need to spend significant portions of time decrypting and understanding these texts. Apparently, the sage himself could utilize natural chakra almost innately to great effect, world-shattering effect even. But the process, which Naruto has self-dubbed as chakra tempering, is one that even Naruto himself doesn't quite understand properly. Because it was done entirely through trial and error. The best way he could describe it was finding balance. A bit like balancing his non-expended chakra in his own body with the slowly becoming inert chakra in the blade until it felt right. This is also one of the few times he was ever truly grateful for the giant natural disaster in his gut, who would heal him from just about anything. Because the amount of weapons that have exploded in his own hands while working on practicing this step would have killed or maimed anyone else but him. They would explode so violently he would often practice with both of his hands stuck through 2 holes in a brick wall he built behind his shop, so that only his hands would actually get hit by the shattering metal. Which is a bit of a stupid solution, but if it prevents him from ending up like Zabuza, with a sword in his neck, then he would say it was worth it. Although, with this weapon, he didn't need to do such a practice. Not only because of his hours upon hours of intense and dangerous training in the matter, but because it already felt balanced internally. It was simply a matter of matching the blade's feel to his own feel, if that makes any sense. Imagine this, it is almost like balancing on a spike 40 feet in the air while sitting on a stone slab, over a volcano. Achieve balance, or you fall in. Only with the weapon the stakes are. Achieve balance or the blade shatters with tremendous power and will certainly send shards of razor-sharp metal into you like a pincushion. After you find the balance, all you have to do is get up and walk away, just leave it. Don't tip too far one way or the other. And voila, you have the mostly self-made or self-rediscovered steps to make a legendary weapon. Before Naruto was the most perfect thing he had ever created in this workshop. The Jishiku or magnet, which may not be very creative, but what can he say, he was never known for coming up with great names. After finishing what Naruto would consider his most powerful blade to date using the most advanced form of chakra smithing he had ever come to utilize, Naruto created a clone to record his notes on the event, making sure to write down everything that occurred to the best of his ability. Everything from the feel of his chakra, how he molded it, his emotions and thoughts at the time, even his intent when forging it. Confident that the clone would do a good job, he made a mental note to later match the new clone's documents with the notes another clone took during the process. All the while Naruto simply went back to his cot and passed out, exhausted from the relatively short events of the day. He awoke the next morning intent on not only showing Masamune Gigi his creation but to apologize for how he had treated the man previously. What the old smith had said was true. He had never really treated Naruto differently, at least not how the villagers had in any way. He had always been supportive of the young smith, allowing him to use his forge when Naruto was just starting out, even if he was doing so partially so that he could sell a lot of Naruto's own creations for a profit. But all things considered, that was incredibly reasonable of him, and Naruto still got to see some of the profits and was often allowed to use materials and time to craft his own personal weapons at no cost to himself. Naruto walked through the village streets early in the morning as he thought these things about the man who truly brought him into the life of a bladesmith. It was early enough that the sun was just barely peeking over the trees, and most of the village was still asleep. Only the occasional dedicated merchant opening up their storefront or setting up the occasional stall along the streets were awake to appreciate the beauty that was Konoha in the morning light. He allowed himself a deep calming breath when he arrived at Masa Gigi's shop. Looking pretty standard for a weapon shop. 2 large windows framed the door, lined with some pretty impressive blades of a variety of sizes. Some of them were even crafted by Naruto, although most of Naruto's inventory left in the shop was gone by now, as he hadn't made much recently that he had been willing to part with, and he no longer used Masa Gigi's forge. Although he did still supply the occasional high-quality weapon to the man for him to sell, mostly just to help supplement his own income. He entered the store with his own personal key, as it wasn't open to the public yet. But that didn't mean Masamune was not already awake and working away in the back. Most likely working on kunai and shuriken, Naruto judged from the very quick and repetitive thuds of the hammer on the red-hot material. not even needing to see what the old man was hunched over working on to know exactly what it was and where he was in the process. These strikes were quick and short, not very hard either. Judging by the lower heat in the room as well, he knew he would be on the finishing steps of a batch of kunai. Probably hammering out the final dings and edges before sharpening them. No polish was around for display, so this was either a private order or a standard village supply requisition. "Does Hokage-sama have you working double shifts, Gigi?" he asked, hedging his bet that it was an order for the village's own supplies from the pure quantity of excess metal on the nearby workstations. The only reply the younger man received was a small raise of the eyebrow, otherwise the old smith seemed to have not noticed him. So he waited for Masamune's attention to shift from his work to notice him in his shop. Although Naruto knew for a certainty that he had known Naruto was in his workshop the second his foot crossed the threshold. Even a non-shinobi knew exactly what was going on in their workshop at all times, let alone a smith with the renown that Masamune Gigi held. "Naruto," the old man let out in a voice that covered every inch of the somewhat small back room of his shop that he used to forge most of his cheap or easier weapons. "Gigi, I've come to apologize for my earlier actions. You were right. I wasn't handling things in a healthy way and I was stuck in the past, I guess." Naruto let the implication hang, as he knew that Masamune already knew exactly what Naruto had been thinking about. The old man knew exactly what happened in Wave Country, and had definitely already surmised why Naruto was angry. He had nearly lost his team again, because, at least in Naruto's mind, he wasn't strong enough to protect them. Even if that was against a ninja more than 3 times his age and strength, that didn't matter to Naruto. The young always think that they can take the weight of the world on their shoulders. And when they try to do so, they often think they are the only ones capable of dealing with it. He said in a sage-like tone. But they often forget that others came before them, many of whom had made the same mistakes and only wished to help. "I understand, but I was so helpless against Orochimaru. And you will most likely be helpless against many others in your future, Naruto-kun. I've seen it in your eyes. The path you walk will be one of intense hardship and struggle. Possibly even sacrifice. That is the way of the shinobi, and doubly so for great shinobi. Which I firmly believe you will be one someday. But how am I supposed to get to that level?" Naruto asked, voice firm yet quiet. "How can I ever achieve the level of strength that these monsters are able to reach?" "Well, for one, stay strong on your current path, as well as by standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before you," the man said, gesturing his somewhat wrinkled head behind Naruto, who just now noticed the large presence behind him. Jiraiya with his kabuki clothes and white mane stood in the doorway of the shop. Apparently having picked the lock, he let himself in. The legendary shinobi chose this moment to speak up. "Now Gaki, I don't mean to pry, but that weapon on your hip seems to be quite new. Why don't we take a look at it together?" At this, Naruto's hand fell towards the black scabbard on his hip, engraved with swirls reminiscent of whirlpools along its length. He may not be sure if he was a true Uzumaki, but he certainly idolized their swordsmanship and craft enough to pay homage to them. The 3 men were now a ways away from Masamune's shop and in a clearing designated as a training ground that Naruto often used, enjoying it for its seclusion from the general population and its relative secrecy. Naruto and Masamune were facing off from each other, the elder smith with a katana already drawn and in front of him, while Naruto held his scabbard against his waist with one hand and the other on the hilt ready to draw. Admittedly, Naruto had a bit of a fascination with the samurai quick-draw techniques, as not only was one draw one kill, in line with shinobi teaching of efficiency, but as a child, Naruto definitely had a fascination with samurai and their cool swords. But in addition to that, with his newfound weapon he believed it effective to be able to surprise others with its effects, which were mostly dampened while in its fuinjutsu-covered scabbard. At least until he could better control it. The white-haired legendary nin stood off to the side, watching intently as the battle began. Masamune rushed in on Naruto at an impressive speed for a man his age, especially one with limited shinobi training. But not nearly fast enough to outpace his younger counterpart. With a motion even the Sannin found difficult to follow, Naruto drew his blade in a flash and knocked Masamune's own larger sword aside with an ease that surprised both the older sword wielder and the Sannin. Jiraiya certainly knew Naruto should be stronger than the aged smith, especially with his superior chakra training, but to knock such an experienced kenjutsu user's blade wide in such a manner with what should have been a weaker strike is certainly impressive. The shock on Masamune's face showed this as he backpedaled. Naruto made a show of tapping two of the older man's weak points with his own blade while Masamune's was still wide and out of his guard. The heart and carotid artery being the ones Naruto chose, without actually cutting his opponent. Then making a showing of backing off 2 steps and shifting from his lowered quick-draw stance to a more centered stance with the blade held out in front of him. Masamune the renowned bladesmith got over his shock quickly, and took Naruto's change in stance as a signal to continue. Moving in quickly but sturdier than he had previously, obviously intending to strike in at the heart of Naruto's guard with a few practiced quick jabs that should be difficult to guard, even with a wakizashi. But Naruto simply tapped the first strike away, which should have been nearly impossible with Masamune's supposedly superior leverage and angle of attack. Masamune simply continued, no longer surprised and unfettered by his young counterpart's parry of what should have been a deadly attack. Naruto nearly stepped into his opponent's guard for the next 3 strikes, batting them away as easily as he had the first one and parrying the last one up and away from both of the trained swordsmen, allowing him to once again tap the old man's weak points with his blade too far away to do anything useful. This time Naruto chose the older practitioner's kidney, heart, and both lungs before backing away a few steps and sheathing his blade. Jiraiya for his part as a legendary ninja did not display the shock and surprise that mirrored itself on Masamune's own face. He was far too cool to do something like that in front of Naruto. But he certainly was surprised. He watched as Masamune got over his shock and sheathed his own weapon, accepting his defeat at the hands of the younger man. You only took 5 steps in the entire time, and all but one of them were unnecessary. The older man finally let out after grabbing his breath. Just what in the hell is that blade? The Sannin thought he may have figured it out, his face finally showing any emotion in his realization. You perfected the magnetic blade? He questioned the young smith. At this question, Naruto simply nodded and patted the blade in its scabbard secured around his waist. Well, perfected is a strong word, but it certainly isn't a prototype anymore. I don't even need to keep chakra in it to interact with the magnetization, he said, pride in his creation leaking its way into his voice. Finally Masamune's face lit up like a light bulb, realization having finally come to him. So that is how you were able to so easily repel my strikes. Your blade literally pushed them away, all you had to do was put forth enough effort to direct where it would go. The old man extrapolated, beginning to look excited. So you've excelled even further in chakra smithing then, have you? He asked, already knowing the answer, as that would be just about the only way he could think of to achieve such a feat. Yes, sensei, I believe I've gotten even closer to the legends. It appears that intent and emotion may play some part in it, or at the very least may affect the blade itself. It almost feels like a genuine extension of myself. And not in that philosophical samurai mumbo-jumbo either, I mean almost literally. The blonde-haired ninja replied in an excited tone. The blade seems to shift magnetization to suit my needs and may even repel other sources of chakra, although I've only recently figured that out in preliminary testing with some of my clones using chakra blades. At this both older men looked quite excited and impressed. If this was true then Naruto may have just broken through a wall that had been standing since the sage himself walked the earth. Or at least since the Uzumaki were still standing. Chakra smithing was an intensely rare and secretive art and is said to be the origins of just about all legendary weapons. From the blades of the 7 swordsmen to the kusanagi, the secrets of their powers lie in chakra smithing. And this 13-year-old just got closer than anyone they have ever met or heard of. He might have even outpaced the Uzumaki clan's knowledge in such an area, including Yuwarikai Uzumaki, who was said to have been the man to have gotten the closest to achieving anything resembling the chakra smithing of legends that the sage could perform with but a thought. Holy shit, Jiraiya let out, his cool and calm facade fading away. There is no way I'm not training you now. At this, Naruto just let out a bright smile. Fuck it, he thought, how bad could training with this jackass really be? Naruto allowed himself to flop to the ground, so exhausted that the scorched earth and grass around him were barely a pinprick on his senses. The training field around him, which was really just a clearing in one of the forests within the walls of Konoha, was pockmarked with large craters, fallen trees, scorched bits of earth, and what appeared to be a rather large swamp that definitely had not been there beforehand. "Yano kid, I really hadn't expected you to fare so well," the toad sage said to him from the other side of the clearing. The only sign that he had been a part of the battle was a few clean cuts through his red jacket and some blood on his clothes, although it certainly wasn't his own bodily fluids staining his clothes. "I wouldn't call you kicking my ass from one end of the forest to the other, faring well. I don't even think I made you break a sweat," the young Uzumaki retorted, doing his best to send a deadly glare toward the legendary shinobi. The recipient of said glare simply brushed it off, not letting it affect him in any way, shape, or form. "That trap with the dozen or so throwing knives and the razor wire had me on my toes. And besides, what can you expect going up against an S-ranked legendary ninja like myself? I can't think of any genin I've ever met that could come within 5 feet of me, let alone cutting my clothes like this," he said, gesturing towards the 4 or 5 holes Naruto had put in his pants and jacket. Naruto would normally be more seriously annoyed at such a response, but the few weeks he had been with the super pervert had conditioned him to his antics and manner of speaking. The fact that his words had more than just a kernel of truth within them helped a bit as well. It is true that Naruto doubted many genin could hope to ever put Jiraiya on the back foot like he had, especially not when the man was purposefully trying to keep them from doing so. Not to mention the fact that Naruto knew this method of training was helping him advance in leaps and bounds. He had certainly gotten much stronger and faster since he started training with the Toad Summoner, even without enhancing his body with chakra. And even though he may not have the perfect chakra control of someone like his legendary teammate Tsunade, he was a ninjutsu specialist and certainly had plenty of new exercises for training and improving chakra control. His kenjutsu and weapon use had also improved dramatically, as Jiraiya may not be much for using a sword himself. His fighting style and sheer superiority in comparison to Naruto certainly caused the blonde to improve by proxy, let alone giving him more experience fighting someone so far out of his league. "How did you activate those throwing knives anyway?" The Sanin's question brought the Jinchuriki out of his thoughts. "They were certainly connected with the wires and seals, but I saw no way for you to physically activate them from so far away." This surprised Naruto, if only a little, that the man hadn't worked out how the trap worked earlier. Although, he guessed that he also didn't have a lot of experience or knowledge about any of his new weapons made with his recent advancements in chakra smithing. To answer his questions, Naruto just extended his hand out above his body, not having enough energy to really bother with lifting his head, and channeled a bit of chakra. Jiraiya looked confused at the motion before Naruto's Jinshaku appeared in his hand, appearing to have teleported from its previous position of being stuck in a tree on the far side of the clearing. "So, you have a summoning seal on the blade. How would that?" "Nope, no seals like that are on it." The blonde cut him off before he could make any further assumptions. "I've learned somewhat recently that I can summon the blade to me, basically at will." The Toad Sage's eyes widened a little in surprise. That was certainly very surprising. Being able to teleport, for a lack of a better word, something like to yourself can be very useful. But without some form of sealing matrix, it should be impossible to do anything like that. "Did you possibly develop some advancement of the Kawarimi?" He questions his young charge. This would certainly be something to celebrate. A technique like this could be indispensable to a ninja. "Not exactly," he responded. "I noticed it about a week ago when I was trying to perform a Kawarimi with the blade after you knocked it out of my hand and charged me with that blue chakra sphere. I figured that since it was basically imbued with my chakra it would be easier to grab onto, but I actually found that I was unable to pull myself towards it," he explained. Jiraiya nodded, remembering it rather well because he didn't often hit Naruto with the Rasengan when he did use it, as even a low-powered version hit like a train and Naruto wasn't one to tank such a hit without good reason. But that still didn't explain how he ended up being able to summon the blade like that. It was a bit like trying to replace yourself with another person, but not quite the same, probably due to it acting like another person but with my own chakra imbued and tempered within it. So I started experimenting with and eventually figured out that I could actually pull the chakra towards myself. At this, he had actually sat up and was studying his creation. Minute movements of the blade allowed him to see the sun reflecting off of it. It was certainly different than anything he had forged previously to this weapon. And it was even somewhat different than the other weapons he had created using chakra forging since he had been unable to replicate, pulling, all of his other new weapons except one, and that one was another anomaly in and of itself. He turned the blade over one more time, still examining it and thinking. He noticed that even the light bounced off of it differently, almost as if it was bending it around itself. He eventually spoke up again. At first it was a bit more like dispelling a clone rather than performing a substitution, but eventually I figured out that I could more directly grab onto the chakra I had used to forge it and call it back to me. He finished speaking and looked back up to his impromptu sensei for the month. So you had the trap hooked onto the blade somewhere in the forest, and when you summoned it back to yourself that released the mechanism to launch all those knives at me. The Sannin filled in the gaps quickly. He had certainly seen Naruto summon his magnetic blade to himself before, but he had always more or less figured that he did it the same way he did with all of his other weapons, using seals that he had meticulously etched or drawn onto his body. But this new method of drawing his sword to himself was certainly something to behold, something that would probably send chakra researchers into a tizzy if or when anyone else found out. It wasn't quite on the level of defying the known understanding of chakra, but it was certainly close. Well, the older man started up, cracking his back in an arching motion. I suppose this means it's time to start up on exactly how you are going to run through the competition, in the exams. The grin he had on threatening to split his face, matched only by the grin of his younger blonde-haired charge. Hiruzen was attending to the relatively small amount of paperwork left on his desk. Mostly new or updated troop positioning reports, important mission dossiers, and a lot of security information that Shikaku Nara and the Information Division had come up with in regards to the Chunin exams in only a few days. When a shadow in his office moved, which wouldn't be an abnormal thing in an office with no less than 5 active Anbu currently hidden within the shadows. Except that this is a shadow that normally should not move, and certainly wouldn't in this manner. The man proclaimed as the god of shinobi simply brought his pipe to his lips and took a deeper drag than usual, exhaling with a very gentle infusion of wind chakra, allowing him to communicate to those watching that they should clear the room. He allowed for another few beats to pass, noticing the final, almost imperceptible change of the last shadow in his office before he swiveled his chair around to face the windows overlooking the village, his village. My Hiruzen, if I didn't know any better I would say you were getting soft. The voice spoke up, a darkened figure having exited their hiding place in his office. Hiruzen simply kept his gaze fixed over the village, not ignoring the voice, but certainly attempting to display something to this intruder. I trust you have returned ahead of schedule for a good reason. He questioned simply. Oh certainly, you know I never do anything without good reason, Hokage-sama. The voice returned, equally even. And you and I both know that I always have the best interests of the village at heart. At this reminder of the mistakes and sacrifices he had to make, the old man only allowed himself a small moment of pain, shooting through his heart and up into his face. The grimace would have been noticeable if he wasn't facing away from the room's sole occupant. Even without being able to see the aged Hokage, the voice somehow knew of the pain that he must have been feeling. You always have been a bit too sentimental for a man called the god of shinobi. It sounded almost like a jab at him, but he knew better. If it was anything, it was the voice's attempt at comforting him or at least absolving him of his mistakes. We both realized this was a necessary sacrifice, Hiruzen, even if you loathed to admit it. But there were forces, both home and abroad, that were simply too much to not make this move. Still appearing deep in thought, the Hokage spoke up. True, it may have allowed you significantly fewer restrictions in which to operate. But what we had to do to sell the story certainly wasn't easy. Not to those involved, or the village itself. Not mentioning how it made us appear weaker in the eyes of the other villages. Ah yes, sensei, the costs might have appeared to outweigh the benefits at first, but I assure you with the information I have been able to gather, and the positioning I was able to gain while outside of your purview, the fruits of our labor are certainly coming to bear. The gentle feminine voice of the intruder finally made itself known. Not to mention the newest crop you have planted, that little Uzumaki certainly looks promising. She continued, allowing her elder to plot the trajectory of her statement on his own. That is certainly true, if anything is to give me hope for the future of this village, it would be Naruto-kun. At this he allowed himself a small smile before continuing. The progress he had already made in his weaponsmithing by the time you got to meet him was certainly more than impressive. But with his most recent breakthrough, I believe he might have just outpaced anything his parents had ever hoped of. While not literally making a sound, Hiruzen could still all but hear his student's head quirk slightly at this revelation. Had he made another breakthrough, his smithing techniques had already outpaced possibly any other non-chakra smith on the continent, living or dead. His furthering of the Uzumaki smithing techniques basically assured that. But to move past that, could he have possibly broken past the known limitations of chakra smithing itself? The shadowy figure's thoughts raced through her mind at top speed, so fast that she nearly forgot where she was, and her purpose here. As much as I would love to discuss this immediately, I have other things that are more urgent, sensei. Breaking herself out of her thoughts, he is making a move, and it has the possibility of causing untold damage to the village. Hiruzen understood now why his wayward student had returned earlier than expected, even if only slightly. And is this move of his your reasoning for introducing yourself into the Chunin exams? His body may have atrophied, she thought to herself, but his mind is still sharper than any legendary blade Naruto has researched. As much as I would love to say it was just to get closer to the boy, and see you again, we both know it is. He believes that he can rely on both myself and Suna to aid him in his little power play. The Hokage's visage hardened upon hearing this. His face became that of stone, as if he himself had been carved from their village's famous monument. Then let us demonstrate to our allies why Konoha has yet to lose a war. It was to the uproar of applause from the hundreds of spectators literally packing Konoha's stadium that Jiraiya watched Naruto and the other Chunin hopefuls walk out. Each with various stern looks etched onto their faces, with the notable exception of Gaara and Shikamaru, who both appeared to be as apathetic as they always appeared. Eventually, the competitors came to a stop in a line in front of the final exams proctor, a lackadaisical-looking jonin named Gecko Hayate. His sword strapped to his back, and to a very keen observer moving awkwardly about the waist, as a relatively fresh set of bandages was woven tightly over his chest. Jiraiya glanced around at the company he had chosen to sit with, the various Konoha Jonin sensei from this year's crop of graduates, as well as Guy, the ever-present green jumpsuit-wearing taijutsu beast practically shaking in his seat, muttering something about youth and his precious students. Kakashi appeared to be glad to have both the Toad Sage and Asumu between himself and the youth-loving man. As if on cue, the green beast spoke up. Yosh, I almost can't wait to see our students battle Kakashi-kun. I am certain it will stoke their flames of youth to burn brighter than ever before. I'm certain you trained Naruto as hard as I did Lee-kun during their month break, and I am eager to see the results of your hip and cool tutelage. Guy, if you shake any harder you may just break your seat. Besides, I didn't train Naruto at all over the month. The copy ninja responded, eyes not once appearing to glance over towards his compatriot. For his part, Guy looked flabbergasted at this, as did the other Jonin in attendance. But before he could speak up about this shocking revelation, it was surprisingly Kurenai who butted in. But Kakashi-san, certainly you aren't so lazy as to completely ignore one of your students like that. Well, for one, Kurenai-san, there isn't really all too much I could impart upon Naruto other than purely physical conditioning. The masked man spoke up, his prowess with his swords far exceeds my own in technique, and most of my other specialties don't really match up with his. Our little Naruto-kun was all but a Chunin when he came to me. The copy nin took a lazy pause. And, he spent far more time with his research and smithing than any time he would spend training with me. He appeared to finish his statement, before glancing over to the other legendary ninja sitting next to him. Besides, it isn't like I left him high and dry, he certainly spent some time training with someone. The look of realization was apparent on all of their faces. So that was why the Sannin was seated with them. Had he spent the last month personally training this genin? If so, Kakashi's half-drunken boasts to them in the previous weeks about his golden team would spear through the competition like he did through porn in public, may not be that outlandish. The collective sensei may not all have a solid grasp on the Jinchuriki's exact abilities, but none of them doubted he was already quite skilled. Even with an at best apathetic population, Word spread like wildfire about a prodigious weaponsmith who graduated early and survived an encounter with the rogue Sannin. Asuma finally spoke up, happy to have something to turn him away from Guy's excited antics. So one of your brats got training from Jiraiya-sama for the whole month. No wonder you were so cocky about their success. Asuma's own opinion of the Sannin might be a little tainted from their relationship with his estranged father, but he certainly still respected the hell out of their power. S-rank titles weren't handed out like candy to schoolchildren. At this Jiraiya butted in, figuring he would indulge the plebeians around him if only a little. Actually, I didn't really spend the whole month training him. I am in the village on business after all. And I only actually worked with him on any strategy a few days ago. Once again, all in attendance balked at this revelation. Either Jiraiya was as lazy as his student's student, or Naruto really didn't need much help for a ninja like Jiraiya to be confident that he could win. Fuck, was the uncharacteristic reply from the Genjutsu mistress, causing Kakashi's face to finally break out into an eye smile, the curl of his lips visible beneath his mask, and Jiraiya's own to appear confused. No wonder you made such a cocky bet, you bastard, she said to the copy nin, who played his part perfectly, looking as innocent as a newborn and gesturing to himself in a "who me" motion. Asuma also looked downtrodden, if less so than Kurenai. Guy was the only one whose expression remained more or less unchanged, still supremely confident in his pupils. At Jiraiya's questioning glance she spoke back up, elaborating on her outburst. The dirtbag bet me 3 months' pay that his prized student would ream his way through the competition. She paused briefly. There is no way I'm actually doing something that perverted you porn-reading Cyclops. I didn't know he was going to be trained by a damned Sannin when I agreed to that, she said, a blush heavily evident on her face. The other Jonin sensei present nodded their heads along with her, apparently having made bets with Kakashi as well. Actually, I made that bet far before I had any idea Naruto would be receiving outside training at all, let alone from Jiraiya-sama. He said before a perverted grin appeared on his face, and besides Kurenai-san, a deal's a deal. I expect the pictures in a glossy print in my hands in 2 days' time, by the way. At the mention of pictures, and the look on Kakashi's face, Jiraiya's interest peaked. And his pervy senses were tingling. I'll give you signed manuscripts of everything I've ever written for a single picture, Kakashi. Whatever you want. The copy ninja's hand shot out so fast for a handshake that an outside observer would swear it was a jab meant to kill. But Kurenai interrupted, if even a single one of those sees the light of day, you perv, I'll personally castrate you with, but her threat would go unheard, as the start to the first match between Naruto and Neji had just been signaled. Naruto stood across from his first opponent of the day. No weapons currently visible on his person, although the telltale outline of some of his larger throwing knives were spaced sporadically about his person. His swords are currently sealed away in an attempt to piss off the Hyuga in front of him. Not that he expected it to work, he just figured he would try. Neji did his best to look the part of the Hyuga prodigy he held himself to be. Stern-faced and all but literally looked down his nose at his competition. Really, what paltry attempt was this at trying to get under his skin? He wasn't nearly as dumb as the blonde's opponent from the previous round of the exams. Just because you were fated to be lucky and have such an unskilled opponent as you did previously does not suddenly make you better than me. He spoke up, this time much louder. I bested you in the academy, and I'll continue to do so here. Face it, you are fated to lose, you will forever be grasping at the coattails of your betters. It was true, if only partially. Neji had graduated 1 place ahead of himself at the academy, and Naruto had only ever beaten him a small handful of times in their spars during that time. But those were strictly taijutsu affairs, so Neji had a significant advantage even without the use of his Hyuga taijutsu style. His superior size, reach, and technique made it hard for Naruto to beat him. But once again, that was a long time ago, and strictly taijutsu. In response to Neji's well-thought-out and scathing taunt, Naruto simply shrugged his shoulders and flipped the older genin the bird, holding his hand out for everyone in the arena to see it. He swore he could hear Kakashi giggle when he did so, but he also shrugged that off as having spent a little too much time with his nonchalant sensei. Neji, now properly incensed, withdrew a brace of kunai and let them fly at the disrespectful blonde ninja. figuring it would at least make him withdraw the gesture, maybe even put him off balance a bit. But what he definitely couldn't expect would be for his target to simply reach out and pluck each kunai out of the air. That wasn't all too impressive though. He had thrown them rather hard and close together, and both Lee and Guy-sensei had done things far more impressive to mid-air weapons from both himself and his bun-haired teammate. What was impressive was as soon as the blonde plucked each blade out of the air, they seemed to disappear. Each kunai went into his hand and vanishing almost as soon as he touched them. It wasn't until the sixth and final thrown weapon was grabbed did he notice anything directly out of place. It almost looked as though his opponent had melted them. But that made little sense. Even some of the strongest fire ninjutsu wouldn't so much as begin to melt a kunai, let alone doing so this quickly. Activating his dojutsu so as to not only rule out genjutsu but to try and figure out his opponent's trick. But he noticed nothing unusual. Yes, he was covered in metal weaponry but nothing that even resembled one of his previously airborne kunai. The blonde simply stood there, as bored as when the match first began. Neji decided trying to puzzle this mystery out was most likely worthless and he chalked it up to a trick meant to further the blonde's mental game. So he dashed in, hands raised and ready to strike. What should have been a devastating combo to many of the blonde's non-vital internal organs and chakra points was merely batted away by the blade that appeared in the blonde's hands. Neji quickly readjusted both his chakra control and his posture. Covering his fingers in more chakra than normal, a lesser-known Hyuga Juken technique that allowed them to combat sharp weapons. And his posture dropped much lower than what most would expect of a Juken practitioner. At this lower position, he was able to angle up and in towards the blonde's chest, another burst of jabs leaving him as quickly and more powerfully than before. But what should have been something too close inside the blonde's guard to have a hope of blocking, was still met with stiff resistance. His first two jabs were met by the lower half of the blonde's weapon. Neji fully intended for this, allowing these opening strikes to push the sword up and away if only half a foot or so. But that was more than enough. His next salvo of blows were not aimed directly at chakra points like beforehand. But instead, they were aimed at his opponent's organs and larger pressure points. His Juken strikes were no longer able to inject his own chakra into Naruto's body due to the change in coverage, but they were able to hit much harder than any normal strike had any right to. He struck 4 times. Both kidneys, a pressure point in the ribs meant to stun, and the final blow aimed at the stomach. But all of his blows were blocked by something quite hard, yet still relatively malleable. Allowing the blonde to tank the blows with almost no reaction, and retaliate by bringing the pommel of his Jinshaku down on Neji's head. The sudden and intense force behind the strike, along with Neji's surprise, brought his head down even lower. His head now around Naruto's waist and off balance, he didn't have the leverage or speed to dodge the next strike, a powerful knee right to his chin. This knocked the Hyuga's head up into the air very sharply, his body following quickly behind his head. If Neji hadn't spent nearly every waking minute of his life practicing and drilling his taijutsu, both with his clan and with the premier taijutsu utilizer in all of Konoha, that blow might have just been the end of the bout. But instead, he landed hard on his back, and in a display of agility proving his work ethic, he rolled into a backward somersault and pushed himself into the air, landing back on his feet. Only looking a bit worse for the wear, and further away from his opponent. Pushing through the head-rattling pain, Neji immediately readied himself for what should have been Naruto pushing the advantage in a series of devastating blows. But instead, the blonde simply stood in place, a smirk hinting at his lips, and sword point tilted down towards him. Neji's eyes narrowed, and the raging fire of his ire burned in his stomach, but he stilled himself. A Chunin, let alone a Hyuga Chunin, did not give in to psychological taunts like that. And that is how he must act if he wished to gain the rank. Besides, with his all-seeing eyes, he thought he may have spotted what allowed the blonde to shrug off some of his strongest blows, but he needed to be certain. His visage shifted to a frown of annoyance, and he dashed back in to re-engage his opponent. Unbeknownst to Neji, Naruto was not playing some deep psychological game to incense his opponent. It was simply rather difficult to pull off this technique, and move at the same time. Sure, he could probably pull it off against a slower or weaker opponent, but a Hyuga was certainly not one of those things. Turning Neji's thrown kunai into molten metal was all but child's play to the weaponsmith. The first step in the chakra smithing process was basically the same as breathing to Naruto at this point, and he consistently did it as a chakra control exercise and smithing practice. But the second part was a bit more difficult. Moving the mostly melted down kunai around his body under his clothes and jacket, heating it, protecting himself from the heat, and constantly playing with the consistency to allow it to absorb a significant amount of the force behind the blows, was a whole nother technique entirely. He actually thought of it because of his sparring with Neji back in the academy, although he hadn't had a workable version down until a few months after he was already a genin. And even then it took him until a month or two before the Chunin exams to be able to do it while fighting, even if he needed to mostly stay in place. But it had certainly been worth the effort and hours upon hours of chakra control exercises and burns along his body. He was able to easily block most of the Hyuga's strikes with his swords, occasionally allowing a jab or two through his guard. A move that would normally be intensely damaging at best, and fatal at worst against a Jukin utilizer. But with his pieces of moving metal armor, he could safely take the blows, allowing him to take out swift and brutal reprisals in the form of strong pommel blows, sharp knees, and deep but non-lethal cuts from his chakra-smithed weapon. After only a few minutes of fighting, Neji finally separated to gauge his opponent. Naruto barely looked ruffled, and the Hyuga prodigy looked as if he had just gone 4 rounds with a blender. Deep cuts and bruises littered up and down his body, 2 more bruises appearing on his face alongside the one already formed on his chin from the knee he took in the opening exchange of the bout, if you can call a one-sided beatdown an exchange. Meanwhile, the crowd was collectively losing their minds, cheers almost deafening the two combatants. The Konoha natives, and those who had some knowledge of the shinobi arts, were not only impressed with the very skilled-looking blur of a fight but at the fact that someone was beating a Hyuga up close and personal and doing so with what looked like apathetic ease. While the visiting spectators were simply excited and enthused about the frenzied exchange of blows, and such an intense opening fight for the tournament. Neji had finally figured out how the blonde was managing to negate his taijutsu so effectively. Not that he actually had anything even resembling a clue as to actually how the blonde was doing it, but he had certainly seen the metal liquidating and moving around his opponent's body, both softening and blocking his blows. The problem was, he had absolutely no idea as to how he could get around it. Even at his faster speeds, the blonde had seemingly little problem using his sword to deflect his blows, and while he definitely could get around the blade if he really wanted to, the gleaming edge of the sword threatened him with what would happen if he overextended his reach even minutely to do so. That meant he would either need to slip past his opponent's guard with a disabling blow faster than Naruto could cut him, which was unlikely seeing as how Naruto had been taking those hits like they were thrown by a Greenhorn Academy student. Or, he would need to disarm the sword wielder, which he also guessed would be all but impossible, not even thinking about the backups he was sure to have. Neji could literally see the small armory of knives and other sharp objects hidden under Naruto's sleek uniform. That did leave one option, one Neji hadn't planned on using until much later in the tournament. But he refused to let a fated failure like the one in front of him embarrass him any further. With a sharp nod, the Hyuga gathered his wits and moved in once again, this time intent on ending his opponent. For his part, Naruto simply kept to the same part of the ground, only ever shifting his body to change his stance or move his sword to annoy, harass, deflect, and injure his opponent. Although something was different from before, the blonde just wasn't sure what. True, the look in Neji's eyes had definitely steeled over, but that was to be expected. He was getting his ass handed to him by someone he considered a destined failure. Someone that the village as a whole had deigned far below them, even though he had graduated early and displayed skill in his chosen arts, although Neji didn't know why they treated him like that. So it wasn't the look in his eyes that had changed. It was only after the 4th set of rapid jabs from his white-eyed opponent that Naruto really noticed the difference. Neji was striking to kill, or at the very least maim him. His heart, lungs, a few dangerous clusters of arteries and veins, even his neck. But Naruto deflected them all, having not allowed Neji a chance to even strike at his body now. Not that he was worried about the damage most of the blows would actually do, as they weren't necessarily harder or faster than before, and he could still use his trick to block and absorb them, they were just aimed with much more intent. Naruto simply wanted to draw Neji in closer, make him commit to a strike more than he should, so that he could begin dealing far more dedicated and damaging blows. Shortening the match, and further displaying his prowess and tactical forethought to the judges. It was after doing this for a while that he saw his opportunity. Neji finally put more power into one of his jabs than he had on anything else he had done previously. Far more. Way more. Naruto allowed this one strike, the last one in a very long series of strikes that he had counted out. Seriously, who the hell calls out and then counts their strikes like that? He allowed this final strike to pass into his guard, once again taking the blow meant for his right lung and blocking it with the melted down form of Neji's kunai. It actually hurt a good bit this time, easily more than anything Neji had thrown at him previously, but it was still nothing compared to a blow from the Toad Sage. Naruto was prepared to strike back out with his sword, looking to make two quick yet deep slashes under Neji's arms in his armpit, making it much harder to throw lightning-fast jabs like he had been all match. But before he could execute this maneuver, he suddenly realized that Neji didn't look panicked or surprised at all. Naruto soon noted why, as chakra was extolled from Neji's body violently as he spun up in the blink of an eye. The force of his rotating technique threw Naruto back, in a manner reminiscent of how Naruto had done so to him earlier at the start of the match. If not in form, certainly in distance and force. Naruto quickly rolled and came back up to his feet, annoyed, but altogether not too worse for the wear. Of course, you can use the Kaden, you arrogant bastard. He let out, both annoyed and begrudgingly impressed. Although his words were barely audible to Neji over the deafening roar of the crowd, this was certainly a spectacle to behold. If you listened closely, you could hear a shout of something that sounded weirdly like "youth" over the roar of it, but both contestants chose to ignore that. The Kaden would make things more difficult in the long run, but certainly not for this match. Slowing his spin down to a halt, Neji stood facing him, arrogance once again returned to his face. You see now that you are fated to lose, no. He bit out, even with your cheap tricks you have no hope of penetrating my perfect defense, your defeat is inevitable. You know, Naruto began, the problem with every other ninja naming a technique like that, something like the perfect defense, or the unstoppable spear, or the lightning cutter, is that it makes it all the more disappointing and embarrassing when that name is proven wrong. At this, a ninja with gravity-defying hair in the stands was thankful for the mask covering his embarrassed face, because it would be far too uncool for one's own students to embarrass you like that in public. He'd prove the little shit wrong at a later date, now was the time to act unfazed and save face. With his theatrically motivated piece said, Naruto abruptly flung his prized sword as hard as he could at his opponent. Fast enough to surprise Neji, not only at the speed and force of the throw but that he would throw his main weapon away. Only for the Hyuga to quickly and easily spin up once again with a shout of "Kaden." Although a brief screeching could be heard from the weapon hitting the technique, it did not pierce it, bouncing off harmlessly to the side. The anticlimax of such a failed throw, seeming like a desperate gambit, was only put off by the very quick follow-up of Naruto appearing in front of him holding something that Neji thought resembled a spear. In the split second, before Naruto could bring the weapon down on his perfect defense, in what Neji assumed to be another futile attempt to overwhelm him, the stern-faced Hyuga was able to recognize the weapon as a naginata, as his teammate had used one on him previously. He watched as the blade was quickly brought down on his protective sphere of projected spinning chakra, and cut straight through it like it was water. Wavering only a minute amount before continuing right on through. Both the force of the powerful blow Naruto had brought down on him, combined with the sudden shock of his technique and therefore his rotation being so forcefully interrupted, caused Neji to drop like a sack of potatoes. Hitting the floor of the arena, his knees buckled under him and removed any energy he had left in him. It took all of his pride and willpower to not simply pass out, and even then he most likely had a concussion from the force of his head slamming into the ground. There was a single mind-numbing beat of quiet throughout the arena, and then a second, and finally a third. Before Naruto was suddenly deafened by the cheers and screams of the gathered audience. Surprise evident from the pause and looks on most faces, but awe soon replaced them. How? Neji asked simply, barely gasping the question out. Even breathing was a bit of a struggle at the moment. Hayate arrived a little late to call the match, but at this point, no one was listening to him anyway. The results were already known. Simple really, it cuts through chakra. His answer was honest and yet just as confusing. How in the hell could he possibly have something that cuts through chakra like that? Neji thought to himself, that is in no way a simple thing. That was also when the realization struck him, if he could cut through chakra like that the entire time, this fight was over from the start. He could have ripped right through my gentle fist even with my extended chakra protection. The realization that he had lost before the fight even began was enough to make him finally release his strenuous grasp on consciousness. The medics had already arrived to remove him anyway, it mattered very little. Naruto, for all intents and purposes, looked as healthy and rested as when he had started the match. Only looking a little miffed that he had needed to reveal his chakra-forged Naginata at all, let alone this early in the tournament. Stupid Hyuga bastards and their stupid, perfect defense. The reactions and chatter in the cage viewing booth was certainly exciting at the conclusion of the match. With 4 village heads in the room who had so far spent most of their time making well-veiled jabs at each other, had all truly been stunned by the conclusion of the match. It was the Mizukage, Materumi, who spoke up first. No surprise really, even without that surprising weapon reveal at the end he certainly had the fight from the outset. She quipped. Hiruzen found her observation to be more than a little blunt, but also entirely accurate. Although, as the Hokage, he certainly had more information to work from than she did. He was formulating a reply, one composed of both wit and class, when another voice spoke up. My Dono, you were certainly quick to count such a prodigious Hyuga out. Please tell me it wasn't simply because Naruto-kun was wielding a sword compared to the gentle fist's bare-handedness. The voice belonged to the leader of Otogakure, the self-proclaimed Otokage, and former Konoha ninja, Orochimaru of the Sannin. For her part Mei did not bristle at Orochimaru's use of the dono honorific, even if she wasn't really on the level of a Kage politically, she was more than fearsome enough power and reputation-wise to be allowed it. Even if doing so broke decorum and brought up a lot of unanswered political questions. Of course not, Orochimaru-chan, spoke the Mizukage, needling her fellow Kage. If I'm not mistaken, and I very rarely am, that is the Uzumaki Naruto. She continued, allowing a pause for the other Kage to turn their attention to her as the next fight was called to start. Some Nara and a Sand Nin with a large battle fan. One of my ninjas has confirmed that, among other things, he is the one to have slain Momochi Zabuza, the former wielder of the Kubikiribocho. The emphasis she had placed on the word former did not go unnoticed by her compatriot Kage, although it had drawn a rather quizzical look from Orochimaru. While Hiruzen had simply hoped that she would have not brought that up, though it was far from the worst secret that could get out concerning the young blonde topic of conversation. That is certainly a factor in your rather apt appraisal of the young man. But I would have to admit it took me until he vanished those kunai out of the air to be assured of his victory. I'm still a little uncertain of exactly how he did it, to be honest. Perhaps you could enlighten us, Hokage Dono. His sand counterpart spoke up, not talking about the Mizukage's previous statement, although his seeming lack of interest in the subject gave Hiruzen as much or more information than if he had brought it up. Oh my, Naruto-kun has certainly picked up and developed his own bag of tricks. His grandfatherly tone gone, the thinly veiled steel in his voice making his knots a hidden meaning quite clear to the others in the room. Naruto was strictly off limits. Even if there were no true rules, at least not really, in the shinobi world. Not pissing off Hiruzen Sarutobi was as close to a functioning rule as anything gets. The death of his son in the previous war and the wrath many of them suffered afterward all but cementing it as law. Quick to clear the tension heavy in the room, his normal warm and inviting presence returned, like flicking a light switch on. I could never dream of revealing them, even if I had any true understanding of their inner mechanisms. Besides, where would the fun be in that? The latter half of his response belied his age and experience in contrast with his surrounding peers. Half-truths, covered in half-lies, shrouded in mysteries, all behind the facade of a grandfatherly visage, from the man once and still hailed as the god of shinobi. Truthfully, without Onoki here, the more delicate art of these conversations was a bit dull to him. Yes, Mei had a wit like the end of a whip, cracking out sharp insights and observations left and right, but they lacked proper depth and intrigue. And Orochimaru was certainly one to needle and prod around conversations with deeper intent. She had been the Sandame's student after all. But many of her statements and observations came out a little too threatening. She lacked restraint in her hostility. Although he guessed that was partially her reputation as a dangerous, and slightly crazy, rogue ninja. Even the Kage, Rasa, who was the second most experienced Kage present, could dig out information and shroud his own like the sandstorms his home was known for. But his reluctance in sharing information, even false or useless information, often left him giving up more concrete data than most others. One may not be able to see the weapon itself, but you can certainly see its outline. Not to mention his cold demeanor made conversing with him like talking to a brick wall. But none of them had truly reigned long enough, and done this nearly enough, to truly work with the wheels within wheels that he and his rock counterpart could. Although, if Onoki actually was here he would have probably been attempting to kill Hiruzen with his vaunted dust release. So that point was probably moot. I have to admit Kakashi, your student scares me. Even if only a bit. Asuma slowly dragged out between puffs of his cigarette. I would certainly never have the balls to let a Hyuga hit me like that, even a greenhorn like Neji. Guy would probably look more offended on behalf of his student, but he was far too busy screaming about the flames of youth. Ma, he's simply too cool to let something as pitiful as a few little jabs slow him down. The pride was evident in the masked ninja's voice, even if his words were full of shit. Kurenai's face fell at Kakashi's statement, having expected a better answer, even if she should have known better by now than to expect a serious answer from the man who reads porn in public. Jiraiya simply let a single laugh escape his mouth, sounding more like a bark than the expression of amusement that it was. Ha, even I don't have the giant steel balls to let a Hyuga hit me like that. Little shit really is something, isn't he? He finished by slapping Kakashi on the back, just hard enough to jostle him a bit. Now that statement even had Guy paying attention. The assembled Jonin turned to the legendary ninja. Guy spoke up first, asking the question they were all thinking sans Kakashi. Wait, Jiraiya-sama, I had assumed you taught him whatever technique or ability that was that allowed young Naruto-kun to defeat Neji so handily. Jiraiya simply shook his head in the negative. Actually, I had no idea he could even do that. Although, I have certainly spent enough time with him to have a pretty good idea of what it is and how it works. This caused the other three ninjas to sweat drop, collectively thinking to themselves, Kami, just what in the hell is this kid? Meanwhile, in the competitors' seating, a shout could be heard. What in the actual fuck was that? The weapon mistress exclaimed, loud enough to cause those around her to shy away. She had been on a team with Neji for a little over a year and had been in a class with him before that since she was 6, and she had never seen anyone beat Neji like that. Naruto just tanked every hit like it was a light punch, and not a rightly feared and deadly taijutsu style perfected over generations. And then he just whips out some awesome weapon and cuts right through a technique that should have been nearly impenetrable. It was a fight, Tenten-san. Are you having problems with your vision? Asked Shino, the genuine concern for his fellow leaf ninja not quite evident in his tone, but you never can tell with an Aburame. What? My eyes are fine. How in the hell did your teammate just cut through Neji's technique like that? I've never even heard of a weapon that could do something like that, it must be worth a fortune. She paused for a moment, before adding on, or 2 fortunes. Shino, now the subject of the unwanted attention of both peers and competitors alike, merely offered a shrug. Simply put, Tenten-san, I have no idea. Why? Because in the interests of my own mental health I have stopped attempting to question or reason out Naruto's actions and abilities. He is simply Naruto-san, and Naruto-san will do things that objectively make no sense. The bug user's reply only caused those in attendance to sweat drop. All of them were curious about the mysterious abilities of the blonde ninja, and most of them had hoped to gather information on a potential future competitor. Could this just be his way of not giving away information on his teammate? Or could it be that even his own teammates have no idea? Yosh, his flames of youth must certainly burn bright to allow him to best my eternal rival. Tenten-chan, I swear that I will grow even faster so as to. The green-clad shinobi's sudden outburst had been cut short by his own teammate's slap to the back of his head. Not now, Lee. I can already feel a migraine coming on just trying to think about this, and I won't lose my match because you needed to prove your youth with some silly competition or self-made bet. Even Lee had the wherewithal to at least look apologetic, drawing in on himself and whispering his new promise to himself, somehow just as intensely as before. Something about climbing every tree in Konoha without his hands or whatnot. At this moment they suddenly noticed Naruto's return to their seating area. And suddenly everyone quieted down, many of them not forgetting what he had done to his opponent in the preliminary matches and were unwilling to earn his ire if it was at all possible. With a nod to Shino, which the bug user reciprocated, Naruto plopped down in his seat and looked down to watch his other teammates match. Shikamaru was in the middle of what appeared to be him trying and failing to corral the fan wielder into a corner with his kunai, or at least to his opponent this is what it must have looked like. When in reality it was a ploy by the shadow user to cover the field in kunai, thereby giving him plenty of shadows to bounce his own off of. Tamari wasn't one to take it lying down though, peppering the lazy ninja with plenty of sharp objects of her own, often buffeting them with wind chakra to make them faster and far more dangerous. However, she was thinking too far ahead, trying to save her energy and chakra for later matches, most likely believing the pineapple-haired ninja was trying to back her off and tire her out, not set her up for a checkmate via shadow ninjutsu. By the time she had figured it out, it was far too late. She opened her fan to not only hit Shikamaru with a heavy wind blast but knock most of the kunai dotting the field into the surrounding forest. But she paused, fan raised and ready to swing. It took most spectators a moment to notice the shadow that had molded into her own. After that, she was forced to forfeit via her own kunai at her throat. At some point during the match, Naruto noticed Tenten slowly making her way toward him. Moving over seats until eventually, she was sat directly next to the blonde weaponsmith. He was content with allowing her to sit there, glancing at him, obviously searching his body for where he stashed the weapons he had utilized during his match. It was shortly after Shikamaru's return and her own teammates' departure that she worked up the courage to actually speak to him. "Sue," she started off, sounding timider than Naruto had ever heard her in the academy. "How does that cool weapon you used work anyway?" Naruto simply glanced at her, mostly surprised that she was willing to even attempt and ask him something like that while they were active competitors. True, they didn't know as of yet if they would be fighting each other. The drawing for the second round wouldn't be done until this round was over. But still, it was a ballsy play. Naruto decided he liked her straightforward approach, also figuring it wouldn't do her much good even if she knew how his naginata worked anyway. She didn't seem like much a ninjutsu specialist. Well, the short answer is it can cut through chakra-based techniques. Although, to actually explain all of the science behind it I would need a few more hours and a chalkboard. He was surprised to see her face fall at his answer. Wasn't that what she wanted? No, I mean how does it work? She stressed the how in her question. I've heard of my fair share of legendary weapons. But something that can cut through chakra is a complete mystery. Like, does it absorb the chakra? Or maybe negate its flow? Naruto heed at this question. Even Jiraiya, who was the only other person so far to see the weapon, hadn't really gotten into the actual specifics of how the blade worked. So Naruto wasn't certain how to answer the question. Well, I guess you could say it's a bit like how an axe cuts through a tree. He surmised. That makes even less sense, was the weapon mistress's reply, although she certainly looked interested by now. Her attention fully turned away from her own teammates' fight. It can be a bit hard to describe because it works a lot through feel. It would be like asking an Inazaka how they can distinguish between smells. He thought for a few more moments, going back to the axe analogy. It's not that it actually technically cuts through chakra, it is more like it splits it, or even redirects it. So is that why it's a naginata then? So when it splits it gives you distance from the chakra? Another good question from the bun-haired girl that Naruto had few good answers to. That is another hard one because the answer is sort of the same. Naruto was actually beginning to look interested in the conversation, which was impressive as Tenten hadn't seen him look interested in just about anything at the academy. It just felt right when I was making it. This caused her eyes to widen significantly. Wait, you mean you made that weapon? Of course, the blonde replied quickly, looking just a little offended. I don't use anything I don't make. Not even my kunai and shuriken. Now that answer certainly sent her for a loop. Well, what about that blade from the preliminaries? Her quick verbal riposte surprised him momentarily. Already trying to poke holes, Naruto thought to himself. Well, okay, I didn't craft the Kubikiribocho, obviously. But that one is more of a sentimentality piece than anything else. It's far too big for me to really wield it properly in most circumstances. His tone lowered a bit, but he did an admirable job of hiding that from Tenten. Tenten continued asking him questions about his weapons and how he made most of them. She was definitely interested in his throwing knives, something about the different weights and balances being a smart idea that is similar to something she does. By the time their conversation had tapered off, they had both noticed Lee's disappearance from the battlefield and an oddly Lee-shaped hole in the wall. Shino informed her he was thankfully mostly uninjured, at least by Lee's standards, and had been taken to the infirmary after Gaara subdued him rather violently and Guy had rescued him from Gaara's malevolent sand. Tenten was soon called down after another fight between the puppet-wielding sand ninja and a mist ninja that was on the same team as the familiar-looking mist ninja that Naruto swore looked more and more familiar. She managed to defeat her opponent, a ninja from Otogakure that had been glaring daggers at Naruto since he returned from his fight. Next, Naruto witnessed Shino lose to the mist, Kunoichi. Naruto couldn't quite tell, but he was certain he knew them now. That was one of the companions that had accompanied Zabuza and fled after he completed the mission to Wave. How had had they, gone back and rejoined the hidden mist? It was hard to be completely certain that Naruto had to just make a guess at their gender at this point for the sake of simplicity, and the masked ninja that accompanied Zabuza were the same person. But that bloodline Shino forced her to utilize was far too similar to just be a coincidence, and Naruto wasn't one to believe in coincidence. Naruto was too lost in his own thoughts thinking about the ninja from the hidden mist to notice much of the next 2 rounds as they went by. Sasuke Uchiha beat a sound Kunoichi that swore like a sailor and was unfortunately a very skilled genjutsu user. If she hadn't been so unlucky as to get matched up against an Uchiha with an active Sharingan, she probably would have done much better. Although, she definitely put on quite the show. The last fight was between Hinata and Kiba, both new genin that Naruto had relatively little information on except for general clan information, which proved to be pretty accurate for both of them. Hinata won due to her superior taijutsu style in the gentle fist, although even from distracted glances Naruto could tell she barely held a candle to her cousin in actual technique or ferocity. This was definitely one of the more boring and straightforward matches. Hokage Dono, your shinobi have certainly done well for themselves. The Mizukage let out after the final match of the first round had finished, taking 5 out of the 8 slots for the second round. Your village certainly deserves the reputation you have garnered for yourselves. The coy smile let Hiruzen know everything he needed to from her statement. She certainly wasn't happy about the outcome, but Hiruzen was certain her remaining shinobi would not be ones to be underestimated. Ah yes, Mizukage-sama, I assure you my ninja have worked quite tirelessly to achieve what they have today. In double speak, of course, you think your remaining ninja is a showstopper. But I assure you, the fruits of the great tree have yet to truly sprout. But we certainly have some dangerous ninja of our own. I love these word games as much as the next Hiruzen, as I am sure you know. Rasa interrupted, but we should get back to the task at hand, at least while they are drawing and preparing for the next round. Always a stickler for work, thought the 3 other legendary ninja seated in the booth. Personally, I believe Tayuya-chan showed more than enough skill and foresight to qualify for Chunin, even if she was so unlucky as to have been matched against her perfect counter. Orochimaru, as always, quick and to the point about anything that held little interest to her. Maybe, but a ninja cannot often control their opponents, and for one such as her to falter simply because of her opponent's superiority in genjutsu. A ninja must be prepared, not only to fight a battle in which they have the advantage but to fight a battle in which they are disadvantaged. Finished the Mizukage, although her vote was still unclear. Personally, I don't believe she showcased enough to warrant a promotion. The Cage answered, she may not have floundered when she learned she was outmatched in her chosen specialty, but neither did she make the necessary moves to increase her odds at winning, allowing the Uchiha to dictate most of the battle. Hi, Cage Dono. Sasuke-kun certainly was able to dictate much of the battle's flow. But I doubt anyone here could find a more perfect counter to Tayuya's current skill set, and she certainly knew that. His ability to negate her genjutsu was quickly ferreted out, and she certainly already knew of his ninjutsu prowess. Possibly if the field wasn't so limited, and the Uchiha wasn't so well equipped to handle slow-moving targets, she would have been able to negate that as well. Hiruzen replied, "She has my vote." The Mizukage let out a hum at this. She could either tie the vote or allow the young kunoichi to pass. This was as much an indication of her appreciation of both Kage's respective views on the battle as it was an impartial vote. The Uchiha had already been passed over for promotion, at least so far as he may have won, but he showed very little in any area other than physical needed for the promotion. But to Yuya on the other hand, well, I suppose she did manage to nearly draw him to a standstill in the forest. I suppose she has my vote as well. The conversation in the boxes continued like this for some time. The four village heads debating and discussing their respective shinobi's talents and mental acuity, before eventually the second round of matches had been announced by the proctor, and he called down the first match in a booming chakra-enhanced voice. "Uzumaki, Naruto and Tenten, please report to the arena floor." Tenten looked at her blonde opponent from her vantage point in the trees on the arena floor. Angry at herself, and angrier at her opponent. This little shit wasn't even taking her seriously, was he? Similar to his previous match against Neji, she had been unable to move Naruto more than a few feet from his starting position no matter what she had done. She began by moving in close to ascertain his skill with a sword, already knowing him to be at least adept at it. But she was only frustrated with her findings, as the blonde refused to bring out any of his bigger weapons, simply using two long throwing knives to block and redirect all of her probing strikes. She had spent a few minutes trying to push him or move him at all before eventually losing her temper and demanding he draws one of his cool swords and fight her. Kami, damn it. Eventually, she realized this strategy would only help him, as she was using up far more energy in her attacks than he had used defending himself. So she backed off and began peppering him with throwing weapons, kunai, shuriken, smaller throwing knives, senbon, even letting a sword or two loose to try and surprise him. But nothing worked. She only succeeded in making him draw out his first sword from his fight with Neji, but he didn't allow a single weapon to even get close to him, sending them all askew with only a tap of his blade, even managing to hit more than a couple of her own projectiles back at her. This had certainly surprised her the first time, allowing two shuriken and a kunai to hit her. Both shuriken embedded themselves in her upper arm, and the kunai came dangerously close to hitting her neck. After that she rushed him again, figuring she could work something out to distract him while they fought, possibly pushing his guard enough that she could at least hit him. Only for the blonde to switch his grip and foot position, holding the sword higher up towards his left shoulder, blade pointed down towards her stomach. She had guessed from the stance that it would be more about jabs and parries than anything else, but she was once again completely wrong about the spiky-haired bladesmith. He just allowed her to swing, stab, jab, and slice at him as much as she wanted, only moving the barest amount using the least force possible, but every time he redirected her strikes. Blows that had even previously caused Neji and Lee to at least stumble or need to dodge, Naruto simply slapped away. She let out a roar of anger, which only caused Naruto to finally shift the look on his face from a passive one to a broad grin. She hacked and slashed as hard as she could, as hard as she had ever done so before in her entire career as a kunoichi. Naruto simply took a half step back, which she took as a very thankful sign of her actually progressing. She stepped into his guard intending to take full advantage of his mistake, in giving up ground only for him to slap her sword out of her hand and high into the air. After that he made quick work of her. She managed to summon a wakizashi quickly enough, taking the first few strikes Naruto sent her way in stride. Before she realized that had been his intention, he knocked her sword low and hard, caused it to nearly touch the ground before he cut both of her hands. She released the blade and went for a kunai, anything to stop this maniac from spearing her through, but she was far too slow. His sword pierced the binding on her stomach, entering her gut. Not deep enough to actually kill her or cause her to bleed horribly, she was an ally after all, but enough to shock her. He then released his sword in her gut, causing her even more surprise. What kind of swordsman just let go of a weapon like that? Before she felt the reason, a roundhouse kick to the right side of her head sent her sprawled out onto the ground. If she hadn't thought quickly enough to release a handful of smoke pellets as she hit the ground, the fight would have been over. Now, she sat in her tree, having bandaged her stomach, and holding Naruto's sword that he released. It was certainly a fine weapon. sharper and far denser than anything she had ever owned. No wonder it took him so little energy to bat her projectiles and strikes aside, this thing was heavy as fuck. Not one to give up easily though, Tenten was formulating a plan. Without his sword, he would be more hard-pressed to block her projectiles as easily, at least enough that she could actually do some damage and possibly even out the fight a bit. Maybe he wouldn't be prepared to defend against his own sword as well, she could possibly utilize it in a close-up fight. And his naginata certainly wouldn't be a very effective weapon for properly blocking the variety and amount of projectiles she planned to use. With this plan set in her mind, and Naruto's sword hanging from her hip in an impromptu swordsman's knot, she was ready. Uzumaki, she yelled, exiting the forest. You may have bested me in the first exchange, but I still walked away with something. Another yell, holding up Naruto's sword, figuring she may as well get a rise out of the guy who stabbed her in the gut. For his part, Naruto didn't appear to let anything affect him. The grin only grew on his face, and his hands flexed empty at his sides. Good, she thought to herself, let the little punk worry about losing his sword. She incorrectly guessed at the reasoning behind his hands twitching. I hope the medics are ready because I'm going to turn you into a pincushion. A scroll appeared in her hands out of seemingly nowhere, causing him to open an eye, although not in surprise. Twin rising dragons, she bellowed, hopping into the air and unfurling the scrolls, assured in Naruto's lack of an adequate weapon to use against her. Before a small amount of mirth entered Naruto's own eyes, and suddenly his sword, the one that had been hanging at Tenten's hip only a moment ago, appeared back in his hands. No matter, she thought to herself, even with it he won't be able to stop so many projectiles at once. And with her worries assuaged by her logic, she let loose. Tenten, a self-proclaimed weapon mistress of Konoha, released what must have been at least one of every weapon with a sharp edge known to man, and some without sharp edges. Hundreds of kunai and shuriken, swords, senbon, fuma shuriken, spears, naginata. Naruto swore he even saw a giant axe and a claymore in there somewhere. Naruto simply allowed himself to continue his bright smile, a glint of steel entering his gaze, before channeling a small, for him at least, amount of chakra in himself and throughout his blade. And watched as every single weapon, every kunai, every katana, every shuriken, every weapon Tenten threw at him stopped about 4 feet in front of him. Most of them stayed put in the air, magnetically levitating. A few of the smaller weapons bounced off or fell out of the air, but not a single one got through the barrier in front of the blonde. After a few moments of absolute shock, both throughout the arena and on his opponent's face, Naruto said one thing, Jinshaku, release. And with a flare of his chakra, thick and vibrant from years of chakra forging and intense training, he sent his collection of Tenten's weapons right back toward her. Most of them were thrown back harder than she had even sent them, although maybe not as accurately. They were still more than enough to slice, stab, and pierce Tenten's body. She did her absolute best to stop or dodge most of them, but far too many made it through her already weakened guard. The technique finished, and Naruto stayed put in his spot, still trying to limit what he shows, as well as maybe put a little fear into his future competitors. Although the grin never left his face, this was certainly a fun match. He didn't get to spend too much time fighting other weapon specialists, at least not without it turning into an emotionally charged death match. Kukuku, Naruto-kun has certainly managed to show off quite a lot. Wouldn't you agree, Hiruzen? The proper dono left out of his name, she always loved to push the envelope. 2 matches against otherwise dangerous opponents, and he never left his starting position. If I didn't know any better, I would say he is showing off. Naruto-kun has always been a secretive one, it is more likely he is just playing it as close to the chest as possible. Orochimaru-chan, his response the perfect parry to Orochimaru's little play. Although, this verbal sparring was as much for Orochimaru's own boredom as it was for the knots of secret shadows that were unmistakable in the room. These certainly are not my own Anbu. Danzo, I hadn't wanted to believe my students' reports, but they appear true. To make moves like this, with foreign ninja of this level around, you have truly sunk low. His thoughts about his former friend and rival grew darker before he was interrupted by one of the other Kage speaking their mind. Well, of course he was able to perform so admirably. Someone who had bested a former member of the Seven Swordsmen would certainly have to be prodigious with the blade. It was truly just unfortunate that this Tenten-san was so poorly matched. Mei spoke up, both managing to acknowledge Naruto's abilities, as well as use them to position her village's own loss in a better light. Tell me, Hiruzen Dono, do you believe this young Naruto would be willing to part with the blade? Her question was one that he had been expecting from her since he was informed she would be attending a week previously. I believe that is a question you would have to ask him yourself, Mei Dono. Although he seems at least partially fond of the weapon, I cannot speak as to how far that fondness may extend. So a non-answer, the Mizukage thought to herself. She should have known the old man wouldn't have given her much to go on, but she had to at least make an attempt. Kukuku, perhaps if you made an appeal towards his sense of history, Mizukage Dono. I believe him to be one well-researched and more than interested in his historical readings, Orochimaru spoke up, although Hiruzen could not see as to what ends she would be doing so. They both knew Naruto wouldn't give up that blade for anything less than a daimyo's ransom. Ah, maybe I will make such an appeal to the boy. Especially if you believe it would work, Orochimaru-chan. Hiruzen thought he saw the path Orochimaru drew, and he knew it would only serve to annoy the Mizukage, at best, and at worst possibly enrage her. The aged Hokage was quick to butt in, cutting off what he was sure was about to be a witty, if ill-advised jab, at the Mizukage calling her some form of prostitute. Of course, as any of us know how difficult it can be to give up our spoils. I suppose now would be a good time to shift the topic of our conversation toward the fights. Ever the excellent politician, Hiruzen had managed to skillfully and subtly shift their conversation back towards the combatants. A subtle annoyed glance was the only thing he spared for his wayward student and her childish antics. Naruto sat in his seat, contemplating his sanity. He had just witnessed an absolute beatdown in the match between Shikamaru and Gaara. While not surprised at the outcome, his brief encounter with the sand-wielding psycho in the Forest of Death revealed enough about him to scare even Naruto, even if he would never admit it out loud. He had originally planned on forfeiting after the third round, after finding out his opponent would indeed not be Gaara but Haku. Because there was no need for him to fight such a monster. Although he had certainly made plans for it, he had hoped he wouldn't have to see him until the third or final round of the exams, and those hopes came true. But then Shikamaru had to go and get his ass beaten to a bloody pulp across the arena in such a short match he wasn't even sure it should count. He had quickly tried to grab the redhead in his shadows, and succeeded, but as it turns out his sand didn't much care for that. And proceeded to grab the shadow user and nearly crush him before tossing him into the opposing wall of the arena. It had only been Hayate's relatively quick actions that saved him from Gaara's follow-up attack. Now the blonde was out for blood. He wanted to see Gaara's head roll. But he also knew there would be no point in it. He had certainly already secured his promotion, and his match against the now revealed Haku would just cement the ruling, even if he didn't come out the victor. Whatever, the crazy fuck still had to fight the Uchiha. Maybe he would do well enough to get revenge for him. Naruto's second to final match in the Chunin exams started off quietly. Both opponents seemed unwilling to be the first to move. Naruto had already drawn the Jinshoku, having seen Haku's quick and efficient movements from his fight with Shino, or was it her fight with Shino? Either way, Naruto was unwilling to be caught off guard. After what felt like a minute of nothing happening, Naruto's excess energy decided to make itself known. So, anyway, are you a boy or a girl? Short, sweet, and brutally to the point. Certainly a man of zero tact, and blunt force trauma. His opponent's face fell, if only a bit, at the question. Kami, I'm a woman. All right. Judging from her reaction, the blonde-haired ninja had obviously struck a sensitive spot. Then, the now identified she mumbled something to herself. And before Naruto could tell her that no, she most certainly could not shove that up there, even if it somehow could fit, she moved. All but vanishing from her position in front of him, he felt her behind him. Releasing a large brace of Senbon thrown with deadly accuracy. Naruto, having already used his magnet trick earlier, figured, why not again? And simply channeled his chakra, only to be surprised, and a little hurt, when the Senbon sailed right through his magnetic defense. The surprise of his defense failing so quickly meant that he couldn't dodge all of them, 3 of which he managed to catch in his forearm. Quickly pulling them out, he suddenly realized why they had sailed through his defenses. Motherfucking ice, he whispered to himself. Of course, they were ice. How had he not noticed that? The way they reflected light as they flew through the air was all wrong, and she had an ice-based Kekkei Genkai. After her next volley, Naruto was ready, blocking them easily with the blade. Not willing to risk using his sword's abilities to actually block them. Not that it was very difficult, she threw them accurately, but Naruto had practice against heavier and faster projectiles against Tenten, even if his sword worked against those ones. He decided now was not the time to dilly-dally or try and conceal too much. This opponent was clearly fast and dangerous. Possibly faster than Neji. Naruto broke into a breakneck dash, straight toward his ice-wielding opponent. Sword suddenly reholstered to allow for a powerful samurai-esque slash at his opponent. Haku managed to look surprised for a second, not expecting him to break his seeming habit of standing still so early into their fight. She was still able to toss out a few projectiles as he got closer, forcing him to slash his sword out to deflect them off to the side. She drew a kunai, a metal one, Naruto noted to himself, although he wasn't willing to bet on it. And the dance began. She was mostly on the defensive, blocking and redirecting Naruto's attacks while looking for openings to either cut him or stick a few senbon in. She wouldn't get any. Naruto kept his momentum, striking her in combinations of 3s and 4s, using lots of quick jabs at her midsection to draw her own weapon out and away from her sides. But she was just as fast as him, and surprisingly seemed to handle his heavier blows very well. She must have noticed his surprise at this and spoke up. My old sensei used a much heavier weapon than yours. I'm used to needing to block far heavier swings than this. Her smile was discreet but noticeable, seemingly an admonition of his lack of strength. Your old sensei, eh? Naruto questioned, landing one more strike on her kunai, this time lacing his blade with his chakra, allowing it to sharpen itself to its true form. Her eyes widened, before Naruto's blade shattered the kunai in her hand. Many in the arena thought this would be the blonde's chance, much like in his previous 2 matches, to quickly best his opponent. So they were all surprised to see the blonde immediately jump back, distancing himself from his opponent. Well, you certainly must have learned a lot from him. To know enough about swordsmen to plan such a dangerous trap, using your own weapon nonetheless. At Naruto's statement, many then noticed the remains of the ice kunoichi's kunai. More specifically, the ice kunai she had made to appear like a normal steel one, and the shards of very sharp ice that were now embedded in the ground where Naruto would have been, had he not retreated. I'm impressed. I didn't believe anyone would be able to guess it was a fake, let alone reason out its purpose. For her part, Haku did genuinely seem impressed, if only begrudgingly. Well, I did use a similar trick to kill your old master. Did I not? Naruto made a venturing guess, believing now that she was definitely who he thought she was. Naruto was not surprised when he saw the look on her face. Anger, sympathy, sadness, some of it made sense to him, but she didn't appear to be angry at him. Which was what really threw him off. So that is how you did it? A cheap trick, she asked, this time more subdued than she had been during her earlier explanation. Naruto would have probably been angrier with her if she hadn't been so correct. But then she let out a short bark of a laugh. Ha, he would have liked that. He would have liked you. Now Naruto really was confused. What? Zabuza-sama always talked about the true dangers of a ninja, any ninja. He was certainly one for competitions of strength and fights involving power, but he always truly loved the art of killing someone stronger than yourself. She spoke to him as if she was telling a story to a good friend. He often taught me that no matter how good you were, the second you got cocky, or even made a mistake, your life was as easy to end as any civilian's. I think he liked that idea. Maybe it was what gave him hope against a man like Yagura. She finished, her eyes going back and forth between Naruto and his blade. Before she dashed back in, approaching Naruto far faster than he had moved earlier. He was so surprised by her monologue and subsequent attack that he hadn't had time to set his defenses. She got 2 good hits in, weaving around his sword through practiced muscle memory before he regained his bearing. A heavy utilization of chakra allowed Naruto to pause Haku, she was obviously expecting some grand technique to fire up. But instead of some large-scale technique, a gentle force just surrounded the Uzumaki as his Jinshaku was sheathed on his right hip, and his Naginata from earlier appeared in his hands. Using the distance his chakra flaring had given him, he made quick use of the Naginata, cutting through anything she created and tried to use to block him. Her kunai shattered, but he was far too quick and ready to allow her to use those shards against him again. He broke 3 kunai and got 4 good slashes on her arms and ribs before the kunoichi eventually flared her own chakra, this time creating a dome of mirrors, from which she appeared to be in all of them. This is certainly going to be a pain in the ass, was all the blonde could let out before the ice ninja began to pepper him with senbon. His Naginata stuck in the ground near him and Jinshaku once again drawn. Naruto had to use all of his training and reflexes just to have a prayer of keeping the senbon away from him. He was still certainly quite fast, and she could only actually lead her fire from one location at a time. But she appeared to be able to transfer her location either instantly or so fast that Naruto was unable to keep track. Even with his time training under Jiraiya, Naruto was unable to keep up with her senbon. He could block most of them, but enough were getting through and hitting him, and enough of those were hitting important spots like joints. If he let this keep up, the fight would soon be over. Naruto entertained the idea of letting her win, letting her deal with the psychotic sand ninja. But that simply wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. With a grunt of effort he flung his blade at the mirror he believed she was either in or moving to. He wasn't sure, it was as much a guess of his senses as an actual strategy. But it appeared to at least cause her pause, which was more than enough time for what Naruto had planned. With a flourish speaking to the hundreds of hours of training, he summoned the Naginata back to his hands and started swinging hard. Using as much chakra as he could safely push through the blade, Naruto both sharpened it and used it like a battering ram against the mirrors. The first blow glanced off, but a divot from his swing was visible. Harder, he thought to himself, senbon still flying at him as he tried to dodge and use the swinging motion of his weapon to deflect them. His second blow left a long and wide gouge across the mirror in front of him. More momentum, was his only thought. With a long swing and intense focus on his chakra control both inside the weapon and inside his body, Naruto brought the Naginata down on another mirror. This one shattered like a glass vase that had been thrown at the ground. Naruto only grinned. His swings became wider and faster, the momentum and intense training carrying him through even as Haku was attempting to pepper him with more and more senbon. Mirror after mirror was smashed and subsequently replaced, but they were being replaced slower and slower, and the senbon were hitting him slower and slower. Haku's energy reserves were obviously dwindling, while his own swings were only speeding up and growing in strength. Finally, as he broke another mirror, it wasn't replaced. Naruto's grin threatened to split his face now. The only thing left to do was break his opponent's will to fight. He continued his motions, arms carrying the Naginata in long and fast spins. His pivoting-like steps were wide and balanced with the blade, total interdependence. Mirror after mirror broke, covering the field in their shattered icy remains. As all but one mirror was broken, he witnessed Haku jump out, straight toward him. Her momentum carried her right in front of his Naginata. She probably believed she was faster than its long arcs, but she was wrong. Naruto had the mercy to dull his blade, if only slightly, with the use of his chakra before hitting her. That being said, mercy was a relative term. True, he could have cut her in half, but instead, he hit her with all of his accumulated force and momentum, causing her to go flying to the side, crashing through not one but 2 trees before the thick reinforced walls of the arena brought her momentum to an abrupt halt. "That one's gonna hurt in the morning," was all the blonde could get out, chest still heaving from his injuries and expended energy during the fight. "Jiraiya-sama, surely you can let us in on at least some of how Naruto is managing to do these things?" Kurenai asked. Admittedly, she had gotten a little excited when Naruto had run into trouble against the Yuki. But his later abilities to smash through those ice mirrors, and tank all of those senbon had gotten her to quickly quiet down. Now, like every other Jonin assembled here, and possibly every ninja that witnessed the blonde's fights, they were all curious. Kakashi had obviously been no help, preferring to remain mysterious and cool, but they figured that Jiraiya may at least give them something. The man simply let out a sigh, they had been like this since Naruto's first match against Neji. All of them having realized that Kakashi had most likely swindled them out of their money, and in one case their dignity. The sage held up one finger. Fine, first off, Naruto's abilities are almost entirely his own. His swords, techniques, everything is something that he made himself with only a few small exceptions. And even those the brat has made it a point to all but refuse to use anything until he puts his own spin on it. The sage gave with an eye wiggle, proud of his short-time apprentice. Then, Jiraiya held up a second finger, and secondly, the sage got quieter, moving in closer, causing all gathered to do the same. "It's a secret," he said with a wry grin. The collective outcry from the supposedly seasoned professional killers was more than enough reward. That should teach the nosy shits, he thought to himself. Finally, the Mizukage looked dismayed. Not that he necessarily wanted her to be disappointed, but she had certainly been getting on even his own nearly endless supply of patience and politeness with her constant assurances that Haku would show Konoha up. Besides, what kind of ninja brags about a secret weapon like that anyway? The Kazekage was certainly keeping his mouth shut about the Jinchuriki he brought. Speaking of, this fight with the Uchiha was starting now. Maybe it will go better for Sasuke than it did for poor Shikamaru. It was safe to say, Naruto was not really surprised by the outcome of the second-to-last fight. Sasuke certainly put up a better fight than most. Lee may have managed to land a hit on the redhead, but his injuries had certainly not made that move worth it. At least not in Naruto's mind. But Sasuke got a single hit in, even if it had only been a kunai wrapped with an explosive note, and he probably sustained less damage than Lee. Although he wouldn't call 2 broken ribs no damage, for anyone other than himself it was probably quite debilitating. Thankfully, Hayate had been more than ready this time, and with the help of Kurenai, they had quickly removed the last Uchiha from the arena and towards the medical bay. Although, Sasuke certainly seemed quite annoyed by this outcome, struggling against his sensei the entire time. That was when Hayate called him for the next, and final, match. Naruto was still more than unsure about his odds in the fight, and it was only his look towards the Hokage that caused him to make a decision. A simple nod, from a cage to his ninja, was all it took to convince Naruto he could win this fight. It actually annoyed Naruto a bit how much Hiruzen still affected him. No matter the distance he tried to put between himself and the aged cage, he still seemed to believe in him. Or at least he did now. And Naruto supposed, that would have to be enough. This crazy motherfucker had to be a Jinchuriki. These were the only thoughts racing through Naruto's mind. I've never felt chakra like this from anyone else. And he was losing control right inside the stadium, in the heart of the village. Fuck, was the only thing the blonde could let out before another giant tendril of sand swiped by him, hitting his chest as Naruto went with the momentum, allowing it to flip him over and land on a tree branch. He was immediately on the move, trying to get out of this monster's range and out of sight. It had started off relatively well. His naginata and a rather ingenious trick with shadow clones had allowed him to actually get a few quick hits on Gaara, drawing 2 deep slashes across his body, right through his outer sand wall, and then revealed sand armor. The chakra cutting qualities of the blade worked surprisingly well against him. That only caused him to go, well, a little crazy, to put it mildly. Pulling up mountains of sand from Kami only knows where, and using it to try and crush the Uzumaki like a bug. Naruto managed to get another slash on him after that, using an elongated wind blade, and that sealed the deal. The arena had been flooded with a heavy, angry chakra, and Naruto was hit with a tendril of sand hard enough to kill a less resilient person. As he jumped through the trees, tendrils of sand swung wildly around, uprooting some, and breaking others in half. The debris alone was almost enough to make Naruto double back, but he knew more sand would follow. Naruto had figured out that when he cut the sand with his naginata, it seemed to sever the flow of chakra within it. And he figured if he could just get close enough to the crazy bastard, he might be able to actually knock some sense into him. From in between leaves and branches as he jumped around the forest, he could see Gaara, high atop the giant mound of sand as it grew larger and larger. His sand starting to take some form, but he couldn't tell what it was. Wait a minute, was the fucker asleep? Really, he was definitely asleep. With the beginnings of a plan that was sure to have both of his sensei berating him for his stupidity, Naruto suddenly stopped on a branch. A small tendril of sand weaved through the forest near him, appearing to be searching for him, or at least searching to randomly hit him and let Gaara know his location. Naruto allowed it to get close before striking out, his naginata slicing through it and causing most of the sand to fall limply to the ground. Only for the displacement of air to tell him something, that an even bigger one now knew his location and had made a beeline for him. This time, instead of running away from it, Naruto jumped toward it, landing on it and beginning to run up the tendril toward his target. What he hadn't planned on happening was for the tendril itself to start trying to latch onto his feet, holding him in place. Stagnation is death, he heard his short-time sensei's voice in his head. Using the naginata he sliced through the sand, releasing his feet and allowing him to continue his run up the tendril. He continued his cutting as he ran up, cutting just enough to both allow him to run up yet not allowing the sand to grab him and hold him still. As he reached the top he made a chakra-enhanced leap towards Gaara, or what was left of him in the giant body of sand, only his face showing through. Naginata poised to strike out at the head before another tendril whipped out, intent on stopping him before he would be within cutting distance of his target. So Naruto made a decision, throwing the naginata in a spinning motion at the tendril, cutting through the extending portion causing it to fall back onto the body. Now, his momentum carried him the last short distance toward his target and without a blade, Naruto used the only thing that came to mind that might deliver enough force to wake this red-headed idiot. Burning down and reforging almost every kunai and shuriken he quickly reformed them around his right wrist and hand, forming a fist. The burns from the process done improperly would certainly make themselves known later, but right now he was too preoccupied to notice. Finally, he was within range and brought his hand down as hard as he could. The last of the Jinchuriki's face having just been covered with sand. And he felt the impact, hell most of the remaining people in the arena felt the impact. A cry was soon heard out, from the red-headed genin and he rewoke and felt the pain of the blow. His sand monstrosity soon began to fall away, allowing both him and Naruto to fall and hit the ground, pretty hard. Laying a few yards from each other. Gaara's energy and sand had all but abandoned him. But all Naruto saw was an enemy who was still breathing, an enemy that was still awake and partially armed. The steel around his fist sharpened and formed into a blade extending from his hand. A crude weapon to be sure, but it would get the job done. As he was closing the last few feet, he slowed down to a stop in front of his downed opponent. He looked absolutely terrified, blade only inches from the now vulnerable Jinchuriki's throat. Wide-eyed and scared, completely different from who Naruto had seen and interacted with before. As if he had never been in any situation even remotely like this before. Had he, Naruto saw his previous fights, he was supremely confident at all times, and never really even bothered to move. Not even when Lee broke through with his intense speed, or Sasuke did with his tricks and explosives. Naruto could almost feel Jiraiya's gaze on him. He knew what the man would say about this, as he spoke often about his philosophies with him. Both of them were rather strong-willed individuals, but Swordsmith and Toad Sage were both ones to develop strong philosophies that they naturally stuck by. The man would most likely say that he had already won, and his opponent couldn't do anything, preferring the less violent and final routes. He lowered his blade in unison with his own deep exhale, breathing out the rage, the adrenaline, his ferocity and drive to not only win now, but forever and always. To snuff out an opponent's chance to possibly win in the future. He overcame it all when the breath left his body, picturing himself in his workshop with a hammer in his hand, a nearly finished blade lay out in front of himself on an anvil. Quite long and straight, most of its shape already hammered out, it was ready for a clay substance to be applied before quenching, in part giving it the curve it was known for. A few final clangs rang out, and suddenly Naruto was back in front of Gaara. A grin spread out over his face as Hayate's voice rang out, announcing him as the winner. But the uproar of applause wouldn't be heard, as the cage's booth exploded into flames. Jiraiya's grin was almost splitting his face. The kid did it, and he did it in style too. He almost allowed himself to celebrate when Hayate called the match, but an explosion rang out and he saw the booth seating the visiting cage and his sensei explode in flames. Fuck. Jiraiya allowed himself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.